There's a kind of wealth that lets you buy mansions, private jets, entire islands, and there's a kind of poverty that has nothing to do with money. This is the story of a man who discovered that truth the hardest way possible. Welcome to Stories Money Never Told, where we explore the stories that money tries to hide. Howard Hughes. If you were born after 2000, you might not recognize that name. But in the 1940s and 50s, he was the richest man in America. Not just rich. He was the blueprint for what would later be called the eccentric billionaire. Hughes inherited the Hughes Tool Company at 18, a company that had practically a monopoly on oil drilling bits. Imagine being a teenager and waking up to a cash flow that never stops. Literally. Every oil well drilled in America put money in Howard Hughes's pocket. But he wasn't the type to just sit around counting money. Hughes went to Hollywood and became a producer. He made films that scandalized puritanical 1930s America, spent millions on productions that nobody thought would work. And they worked. He bought TWA, transforming it into one of the world's largest airlines. Not because it made financial sense, but because he loved airplanes. Hughes was a pilot, engineer, visionary. He broke speed records flying around the world. He was on magazine covers. He dated Hollywood's most beautiful actresses, Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, Ginger Rogers. By 40, Howard Hughes had everything. Absolutely everything. He could call anyone in the world and they'd answer. He could buy any company he wanted. He could have any experience available to a human being. And then something started to change. It was gradual at first. Hughes had always been a perfectionist, always obsessed with details. But in the 1950s, these traits began to distort into something darker. He started washing his hands. A lot. Dozens of times a day. He developed elaborate rituals for how to pick up objects. He made his employees follow absurd protocols for delivering documents, using multiple layers of tissue paper, never touching the paper directly. Hughes began to isolate himself. First, it was just a few days without seeing anyone, then weeks, then months. He locked himself in dark hotel rooms, windows sealed with tape, so no dust could get in. The man who broke aviation records was now afraid of invisible germs. The man who dated Hollywood's most glamorous women could no longer touch anyone without having a panic attack. And here's the cruel twist. The richer he got, the worse it became. Every extra million gave him more power to isolate himself from the world. More money meant more ability to build his private prison. Hughes hired armies of assistants, but only so he'd never have to go out. He bought entire hotels, but only to make sure nobody would bother him. His businesses continued generating colossal fortunes, but he was becoming a prisoner of his own mind. He had something called OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. At the time, nobody really understood it. There was no treatment, no understanding, just the silent judgment of people who thought he'd gone crazy. Hughes could pay for the best doctors in the world, but he couldn't accept help. His pride, his need for absolute control, wouldn't allow him to admit weakness. So he used his money not to heal himself, but to hide his symptoms, to build a world where he'd never have to face his fears. The 1960s witnessed the complete disintegration of Howard Hughes as a public figure. He moved to Las Vegas and rented the entire top floor of the Desert Inn. When the hotel asked him to leave to free up rooms for paying customers, Hughes simply bought the hotel. Problem solved. but not solved, because the prison only got bigger. Hughes began living in a single room, completely naked, letting his nails grow several inches long, his hair matted. He watched the same movies repeatedly, dozens of times. He stored his own urine in jars. He was terrified of contamination, but lived in conditions anyone would consider unsanitary. His employees followed insane memos. One of them, which leaked years later, was a 3-page manual on how to open a can of peaches for Hughes. 3 pages. To open a can. And the most tragic part? He was still a billionaire, still controlled an empire. His companies still did million-dollar deals. But he was trapped in a dark room, terrified of dust. Think about that. Howard Hughes had enough money to buy freedom. But the only thing his money did was buy a more elaborate, more comfortable, more isolated prison. He could buy anything, literally anything. A country, if he wanted. But he couldn't buy peace of mind. He couldn't buy mental health. He couldn't buy the courage to ask for help. In his final years, Hughes became a ghost. He moved from hotel to hotel, always at night, always hidden, always running from invisible enemies. His few close assistants were the only ones who saw him, and what they saw was terrifying. A man who had been a god on earth, reduced to a shadow. In 1976, Howard Hughes died on a plane being transferred from Acapulco to Houston. He was 70, but looked 100. He weighed only 90 pounds. His body was so deteriorated that the FBI had to use his fingerprints to confirm it was really him. Nobody believed that skeletal corpse was the legendary Howard Hughes. So what does this story teach us? Because it's not just about an eccentric billionaire from the 60s. It's about something much deeper. Howard Hughes shows us the central illusion of money. We grow up believing that money buys freedom. And to a point, it does. If you're broke and can't pay rent, money absolutely gives you freedom. If you're trapped in a job you hate because you need the paycheck, money liberates you. But there's a point where more money doesn't buy more freedom. In fact, it can do the opposite. It can give you tools to avoid facing your real problems. Hughes could have sought help, could have worked with psychiatrists, therapists, but his money allowed him to avoid that. It allowed him to build an alternative world where he'd never have to confront his fears. And that alternative world became his prison. How many people today do smaller versions of this? Use money to avoid difficult conversations, difficult relationships, difficult truths about themselves. Buy expensive distractions instead of facing loneliness. Accumulate possessions to fill emotional voids. Money is an amplifier. If you're healthy, it amplifies your health, gives you access to better doctors, better food, more time to exercise. But if you're sick, especially mentally, money can amplify the illness. It can give you resources to avoid healing. And here's the real horror of Hughes's story. He knew. In his moments of clarity, he knew he was trapped. But pride, fear, untreated mental illness, all of it conspired against him. And his money, instead of saving him, just made it easier to sink. Howard Hughes was buried in Glenwood Cemetery in Houston, next to his parents. The man who once flew around the world, who dated movie stars, who built empires, was laid to rest in a simple, private ceremony. Only a few people attended. His empire was fragmented in legal disputes that lasted decades. His legacy became a footnote in history books, but his story remains as a warning. You can have all the money in the world and still be a prisoner. True wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in health, in real connections, in facing your truths, however painful they may be. Howard Hughes could buy anything, anything except the one thing that really mattered: the courage to confront himself, to ask for help, to be vulnerable. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Stories Money Never Told, because there are thousands of stories like this that the business and money world would rather you not know. Stories that reveal inconvenient truths about wealth, power, and the human condition. Until next time.